Hello everyone and welcome to this session about CSAT English and the portion of the CSAT exam which deals with reading comprehension and the English portion of that examination, which as you know is a qualifying exam. It's not a competitive portion of the exam, the CSAT, in that the score that you get is should just be enough to make sure that you qualify, and you don't need to be competitive in it. You don't need to score better than everyone else. There's no cutoff in the CSAT. Now, what about CSAT in English deserves attention, and what do you need to know about it? Now, I am assuming that if you're watching this video, then English is somewhat of a problem for you, and language is a challenge for you, and that you've not been comfortable with it. And many students have the issue, and English can be a very weak portion, a skill for many people. And there are ways to improve it definitely in a very short time to a level where CSAT stops being a problem, at least. Although the language itself takes a bit of time to assimilate into the mind, such that the rules of it become clear and that you become fluent in it and you can easily and quickly recognize patterns in a language. That's true for every language, not just English. But the level of understanding which the CSAT requires is not very high. And anyone with the basic intelligence can capture it as you become more accustomed to the language. So I'll tell you about some things which you need to know. And by the end of this exam, at least the English portion will not be a challenge for you. In fact, if math is an issue for you, and the other part of the CSAT, as you know, is math and general mental ability and reasoning, if those topics are difficult for you, if you find those challenging, then your skill in English can definitely help you in a large extent, to make sure that this qualifying mark is reached with ease. And it's worth getting into because you want to get this anxiety out of the way completely, because CSAT is not worth spending too much time on. So what type of questions can you expect in the UPSC exam? Reading comprehensions are universal. Everywhere in the world, you'll be given a passage, and the passage is going to be about something. It could be about any topic. So the passage which you see here, and this is of course the a previous year question of the UPSC exam itself. One of the passages talks about democracy and what welfare means and what the relationship between the markets and democracy is and how it pertains to welfare and how unemployment, etc., comes into the picture. Now, after reading this passage, this paragraph, you should be able to answer the question. The question wants to ask you, with reference to the above passage, which of the following assumptions have been made. Now, the thing here is that they don't want you just to tell them what the passage means, so it's not a factual question at all. The assumption which the passage makes is talking about something indirect, right? The questions are going to be indirect, which means that they will not have a very clear cut answer which you can just pick from there and then substitute to get the right answer. That means that the assumption, the underlying underneath meaning of the passage is being asked, and they want to figure out if you have been able to capture that underlying meaning correctly. And this requires a little bit of time and a little bit of practice. But before going further, I should tell you that regardless of whatever topic or whatever passage or howsoever complicated it is, all the information for you to answer that question correctly, accurately, is going to be there. That includes the indirect things, that includes things which are not stated explicitly, and some assumptions and some implications and such type of variations that which they ask are there in the passage, and you just have to get better at spotting them and understanding the underlying meaning of the passage. And I'll tell you exactly how to do that, not at all to something to worry about or to be intimidated by. Now, I mentioned before that the variety of topics is going to be very extensive. So you might encounter a passage from history, you might encounter one from biology, perhaps from physics. It could be anything. It could be literature, arts, theater, whatever it might be. It will be a passage which you'll have to get used to very quickly, relate to the contents of the passage to understand it enough to answer the questions. Okay, so you need to get comfortable with the variety. You don't need to be a subject specialist, obviously. You just need to be someone who can read a passage, regardless of where it came from, understand the context, what it is talking about, what appears to be the center of attention here, and relate to that only using common sense and understand the meaning behind it. And the way this typically happens, and the reason that it proves to be challenging, is this is a scientific model of processing. You don't need to get into the technical details of it. This one was created by Craig and Lockhart, very popular cognitive psychologists, and they basically were able to systematically define how processing in the mind increases. And the point that I'm trying to make here is that processing occurs in stages. You can see a text, and that text will look like a series of black and white blots on a piece of paper, right? They don't really mean anything. But slowly, as you look at it, your mind starts to figure out words which it finds familiar. You'll find words which you've read before, and you realize that, okay, this word pertains to this particular thing, and that's what it means. It will trigger that knowledge network in your mind. Slowly, the sentence and the meaning of the sentence will also begin to get captured, and then you will be able to get a sense at the end of it at the entire narrative and the emotional appeal of the text. All of these are layers, okay? So if you are not able to capture the more implicit details, it just means you've not been able to reach the layers of understanding, and that requires a little bit of practice and a little bit of a few techniques to get to know and relate and have this engagement with the text that you're reading. So you need to have a conversation with it. When you see a passage, you need to ask yourself what this is about. You need to get involved. You can't just passively read it and expect to understand it. You need to engage with it. You need to meet it, and you need to get interested in it for a very brief amount of time. That's the trick about the variety, which then you can defeat after you practice plenty, and I'll tell you exactly where to practice from. The other thing you need to realize is that reading is nothing but an act of translation. As Indians, for most of us, English is a second language, which means that our mother tongue is the language which we grew up with, and we've had to understand and learn English because it's so important in the world now. It's the language of science. It's also the language of the internet. So in the UPSC exam, the level of English that is required should be enough. And they basically wish to understand if you've been able to understand the deeper meaning, if you've been able to understand the context without being explicitly stated, right? And so reading is a translation. What your brain does is it sees text, it sees sentences, and it sees paragraphs, and it starts to convert subconsciously those paragraphs into the language which your brain understands best. Maybe it converts them into your mother language, and then you hear an echo of your mother tongue in your mind while reading, and that starts to make sense. And maybe that process becomes so automatic and so fast and so efficient that you hardly realize it, and you keep translating it as you keep reading, because the brain is a marvelous thing. The important thing here for you to realize is that it is nothing but translation, and as a translation, it is dependent on some mental muscles, so to speak. And as you practice, those mental muscles become better, the translation becomes faster and very quick. And of course, you've seen this with any skill that you've gotten better at. So how do you engage with the text? How do you make sure that that one paragraph passage is read and understood to the point that the answer can be handled, even if language is not too much of a skill, or if it's something not in your comfort zone? And that's okay. So what you need to do is first ask yourself some questions. What is this topic going to be about? Like I mentioned, you need to visualize it, and I'll have something to say about that. And you need to ask yourself questions. What do I already know about this? What is it that this is talking about? Is it something that I've read before? Is it something that is pertinent somewhere? I read it perhaps in general studies or wherever that might be. Just ask yourself enough questions, so that whatever knowledge you have stored in your brain about it, whether it's dinosaurs or it's fossils or it's art or it's Leonardo da Vinci, whatever the topic is, whatever your knowledge base is, kind of gets triggered. And if not the particular topic, then something related to it, so that you start to engage with it. Just trigger that. That's more than enough to then proceed. You need to connect with what you already know about things. Like I mentioned, you need to identify the key themes, and the reason that that topic, that paragraph is sitting there in the question paper is because it's trying to convey something, and they want to figure out if you've been able to capture this, right? And like I mentioned, reading is essentially an act of visualization. Now, visualization is an interesting thing, and we do this all the time without knowing it. We also build narratives around the text that we read and the stories that we read. This visualization is very important, and the more you do it, the better you become at reading, the better you become at processing, and the deeper the processing is going to happen, because essentially your brain learns almost all learning. Almost all learning, as cognitive psychology is telling us, is visual. You are essentially turning things and patterns into images, and it is those images which your brain then perceives and captures the meaning from. An interesting thing about reading comprehensions and something which you will encounter in the UPSC exam is that it's not just about that passage over there, but it's about the emotion that that passage is trying to convey. Maybe it's a patriotic passage, or maybe it's a passage written in anger by the writer who is critiquing something or lamenting the state of some things in the country, or whatever that might be. There is a sentiment which is conveyed, and that sentiment can be captured, and you will automatically feel something in you physically as you read it, as you try to understand what it is, as you engage with it. And it is this emotion sometimes that the question itself will ask you. Perhaps the question which they ask you is, what is the sentiment that the author is trying to convey? And such type of questions are frequently asked. So it is about understanding not only what it means intellectually, not only academically, but also what is the tone of that passage. And I'm just mentioning these things, highlighting these things. I'm going to tell you exactly where to do it from. Where are you going to do English from? Like in mathematics, English is universal, and there are agencies and companies and educational organizations all across the world who are experts at this, right? And the biggest expert, the gold standard in English language testing is the IELTS, the International English Language Testing System. It's a test, and it's a test which most Western countries, most English-speaking countries use to understand what is the English level proficiency of a person. So if you were to go abroad for studies, your IELTS is probably going to be one of the requirements. They need to understand what your score is, because it tells them very scientifically, very objectively, what level of comprehension it is that you have with regards to English. And so they've been doing it for so many years that their system is very, very well refined. And their questions are created in such a way that they will penetrate your mind and you will have to think for yourself. So solving these reading comprehension passages, which the IELTS contains, that level is very similar to the CSAT level, almost the same level, not too high, not too low. If you were to go into the GRE, for example, the GRE is another exam, the Graduate Records Examination, another international exam, that the level of English in the GRE might be a little bit too advanced. You don't need to go to that level. No GMAT level is required. IELTS level is perfect, right? That is the perfect type of practice as well. And so this, unlike mathematics, can be done for absolutely free. Not a single penny needs to be spent on any coaching institute, on any test series whatsoever. And I'll tell you exactly how to do that. The first thing I've done is I have found an excellent practice test for you. And this is an IELTS practice test. It will contain larger passages. In the UPSC, passages will be smaller. In the IELTS, passages may be larger. But I want you to read these passages, because it is through these that your actual intellectual exercise will occur. The type of exercise which is required for you to solve those questions properly and efficiently. I want you to go through those passages and solve those questions, because they will really force you to think and revisit that package and start to make linkages. As you do that, your understanding level and your processing level will get deeper. This practice test is only there so that you can analyze where you stand. So if you are considering to invest a lot of time in English, maybe your fears are overstated. Maybe you don't need to spend so much time in English. And the way to figure that out is how weak or strong you are, is to give this practice test along with the answer key, which I will share with you, of course, and figure out if you have 60% or 70% or more marks, then you are well prepared for English. It's not going to be an issue for you. If it is dipping below 50, then there might be an issue, and you need to practice just to make sure, even though in the CSAT English is going to be 50% and the other half is going to be math, but I just want to make sure that you are very safely across the qualifying marks, and that's why 50% and less to me is a problem, and you need to make sure that you figure this out. The way to figure it out is to just practice, nothing more. Repeated exposure, repeated exercise, repeated mental intellectual exercise of English processing on constantly will do that job. Nothing more is required. No tricks as such exist, just a desire to engage with the text. That's it. And practice and repetition. Simple, dumb repetition will get you there. Nothing more is required. Nothing sophisticated is needed. How will you do this practice? Where will you find this practice from? I have found an excellent question bank for you which contains thousands of reading passages and questions. Thousands of them. There are more than 100 tests. I am sharing that with you. You can go through it. It is the perfect type of practice which you require. There is no need to join a coaching institute or pay for a test series or whatever. Just practice these. If in the practice test your score is 50% or less, then solve at least 5 or 10 of these. Solve at least 5 or 10 of these. If you are comfortable with English, perhaps solve 2 or 3. You will be comfortable and your confidence level at least will not shake. And so that should take care of English for you. I've told you that it is nothing to worry about and that it's simply a exercise. It's a muscle which you need to strengthen, and that too enough to make sure that you survive the basic type of questions which are asked, and then you begin to appreciate the text. And the reason, I suppose I should tell you this, that they ask all these different type of topics and why reading comprehension is important and why in the civil services aptitude test such a thing would be asked is not only because English is very important and in a means of communication as such, it is an important language, but there are other languages as well. The national language exists for that purpose. The reason that you are being asked to do English here in reading comprehension and all types of different topics are also asked is because you are exposed to, in the job of a civil servant, all different types of topics, especially in the generalist services, right? And so you need to be able to quickly understand what that issue is, even if you are not a specialist in that area, and to appreciate the complexity and to be able to make intelligent decisions based on that. And that, I think, with that approach, if you go into it, it should be very good intellectual exercise and very good practice for you. Like I mentioned, not at all hard to do, all very easily capturable, should not take you more than a few weeks of time. I suggest that if you find yourself in the danger zone even a little bit, make sure you do this, you get it over with, you become comfortable, put it out of the way, and focus on your other subjects, especially the general studies, because that is where the competition really lies. I hope this has been helpful. All these resources will be incoming to you. I hope you make the most of them, and I will see you next time.